Hi students, it's Mrs. T again, and we are going to continue to talk about population and demographics. And behind me on the screen, you will see the week 4 folder for our Blackboard class. And one of the pieces of information that's in that folder is this item that gives you a lot of different abbreviations that are necessary for you to know what the heck I'm talking about when I say them over the course of these few videos that you're going to watch. Most of which I made, but I'm going to curate some videos from other content for you to watch for this week also. So it'll be mostly me, but you'll have a break from me for a little while and see some other people too. Anyway, back to these abbreviations. These abbreviations represent significant data points that we look at as geographers for population information. Population growth in particular is what we use these for. And so those population pyramids that we learned about in a recent video, we're going to look at them again in just a second and understand better with these words or these abbreviations what the different shapes of the pyramids are, how to interpret them, and also the different stages of transition that populations go through, suggested stages of transitions that populations go through as they build and population grows and maybe stabilizes and maybe declines over time. And this is also tied to health. So you might notice chapter 2 in our textbook is talking about population and health because the food supply and the industrial revolution and machines taking the place of human labor and all of those common themes that you remember from your history class. This is not a history class, but we have to know history to be able to interpret some of these trends. All of those things play a factor in whether you come from a wealthy country, a middle income country, or a low income country. In poverty, for instance. And also it depends on, it will affect the number of people who can mature, survive to adulthood, that is, the lifespan, the life expectancy that exists from one place to the next. So there's a ton of topics that we're going to be covering this week. And so let's get to it, okay? So these abbreviations that you see here are going to be, the first 3 anyways, are going to be featured predominantly in the first few videos that we talk about, or the first few lessons, that we talk about this week, because we're going to look at something called the demographic transition model. Now, this is a model for the population expansion of England, really, over time, over the last 500 years or so. But this graphic that was produced from the observations that were made in population growth over that period in Britain can be applied to all populations all over the world today. And so it is important to understand those trends in the transition of populations from small populations, young populations, high death rate populations, or, low growth, low natural increase because the high death rate equaled the crude birth rate. So these different data points are combined onto the demographic transition. And also, let me say this word slowly because I have a hard time saying it, the epidemiological transition model also. So the epidemiological transition model looks at the primary reasons for deaths, the number of deaths, not just, growing to old age and dying of natural causes, but maybe was it pathogens, was it chronic diseases, that kind of thing. And so we're going to look at those issues, and they all are linked to development and being able to produce food and or being cultural aspects like birth control or early marriage or religious beliefs. And so all of these kinds of factors that are included in our demographic category affect attitudes and ideas about population growth, decline, prevention, etc. This is a hot button topic in life today. You've got people like Elon Musk going on podcasts and saying that we need more population because there's not going to be any workers in the future, and that this is a problem. And he proclaims that he's going to have lots of children himself. And you have other folks like Bill Gates, older but also tech genius, who claim that population control must happen, especially in impoverished countries where birth rates are just off the charts, etc. You've got people like Klaus Schwab with the World Economic Forum and the UN talking about population control also in order as almost a tool to control poverty or to alleviate poverty. So let's get into looking at these different ideas, these different thoughts and ideas about population. So first, let me talk to you about a fellow named Thomas Malthus. And so I have this information, this journal open about Thomas Malthus, who was an economist from this period of time, roughly right when the Industrial Revolution was going on. And he noticed in his lifetime, he himself was a victim of birth defects from malnutrition. His mother did not have enough nutrients when he was in the womb, and therefore he was born with several different issues that could be corrected medically at his stage in life. But if he had been at the era in which he was born, but if he had been born at any other place or time, those medical advancements might not have been there to actually, save his life. But he is a significant figure for us to talk about here because he wrote essays on the observations he made about the growth of population and population's doubling time. We have a video that you're going to watch this week about doubling time for a population. For instance, in chapter 2, it talks about 2,000 years ago. So this would have been, I'm looking at the book now, this would have been at the birth of Christ, or the initial part of the birth, the Common Era. We say CE for Common Era, or AD, Anno Domini, however you observe the dates listed. So about 2,000 years ago, the world's population was 250 million people. Now, to put that was an estimate, of course, because there weren't like world records where, a repository where people could go and look up records. This was an estimate. About 2,000 years ago, there were 250,000 people, 250 million people on the entire planet. And then, let's see, 16 centuries, that is 1,600 years later, that number had doubled to 500 million. Again, this is an estimate because still, even though records were being kept a great many places around the world, that doesn't mean that those records were shared with people all over the world. So keep in mind that was 16 centuries, that's 1,600 years. And now I'm about to tell you that 170 years later, it doubled again to 1 billion people. So from 16 centuries, which is 1,600 years, to 170 years only. So just a little over 1.5 centuries, it doubled again. And then over just another century, so 110 years, it doubled again. So we're talking about the doubling time of population. And there were some significant historical events that occurred to facilitate this in the Western world, at least. Those that had Western culture had some significant events like the Industrial Revolution, which made agriculture much more easily accomplished. So the surplus that was produced in agriculture enabled people to live longer and become healthier and that kind of thing. So we'll talk about that in just a second. So that was 1930 when we reached estimated world population of 2 billion. And then only 45 years after that, it was 4 billion. So we had in 1975, 4 billion. So you see that we are shrinking the amount of time it takes to double the world population. And so now we are at 8 8 billion people. This website here behind me is populationpyramid.net, and you can see that the population of the world is just under 8 billion people. This was the 2020 numbers, so we're 2 years after that. But this website, populationpyramid.net, puts the countries of the world in order based on their population, and look at the two largest population countries. Wow, they are whoppers. They contribute to a lot of the world population, but then USA, even though this is a significantly smaller number than than China and India, we are number 3. And so these topics, population, affects not only wealth versus poverty, it affects the impact that we have on the planet, and all sorts of other issues in terms of health and wellness and those kinds of things. And so what we're going to do in the next video, you're going to look at a video on doubling time, population doubling time, but then you're going to be back with me and we're going to talk about demographic transition and that epidemiological transition model also to determine what was contributing to those crude death rates and what was causing so many people. Let me see, here it is. So we're going to be looking at demographic transition in this different graphic format. I popped over to this one really quick because it has population pyramids here at the bottom. And of course, we learned to interpret those in a previous video. But if you look at this population pyramid where the cursor is highlighted, where you have really slow population increase, a stable or slow population increase, you see a ton of babies are being born, but by the time they're 15, at least half of those babies that were born died. And so we've got child mortality rates, infant mortality rates that are affected greatly by the amount of disease or malnutrition, the food supply. It's connected to the food supply. So we're going to be looking at these kinds of issues in the next video when we go deeper into the demographic transition model. Okay, so Thomas Malthus lived in the middle of the Industrial Revolution when food supply was increasing, but he studied and observed that though the food supply was increasing, population was increasing at least twice as quickly. Geometrically, he said, population was increasing, which makes let me see if there's a graph here. If population increases geometrically, you've got a really sharp, steep curve upward for the population to be increasing. And if the food supply continued at the same rate that he observed in his lifetime, then the population would far outgrow the food supply and you would end up with tragedy. And he called for population control. He called for things like birth control or same-sex unions. He called for things like women to be celibate until they had a profession of their own and were later in life. He said that women got married too young. This was a cultural thing at the time. If you were 14, 15, often that was considered a woman and not a child like we would define it today. The role of childhood has significantly transitioned also as the demographic transition model has taken place. I'll show that to you in just a minute. But the role of women and the status of women in society was something that he called for an uplift of this so that women would wait till later on in their lives to marry, and therefore they would skip a good 10, 15 years of childbearing years. And just by that one culture change that he called for, in addition to those others that I mentioned, he suggested that we could stave off the tragedy of the population outgrowing the food supply and the poverty that would exist if that was the case. So Thomas Malthus is also somebody who you will hear a little bit about, not quite so much now that the COVID pandemic is kind of part of our daily life and we understand it. But he called for also, or not called for, but explained that a good pandemic or epidemic every now and then that killed off a large portion of the population was a good thing for population as a whole. Of course, you have to be very detached from the people who are actually the ones dying in order to make such a proclamation or to call for such a thing. But in fact, natural causes of death, such as diseases that spread throughout the population. Some of you watched the cholera video for Project One, the history of cholera for that Mr. Help analysis. And so you know that diseases spread through a population for a variety of reasons. The Black Death is something that I think someone, maybe not for geography class, maybe for sociology class, wrote a reaction paper on recently. And so certainly these kinds of communicable and very highly contagious and deadly diseases definitely, can I say, help control the population, to use Thomas Malthus's point of view. Okay, that's not Mrs. T's point of view. It's good that diseases kill people. No, Mrs. T did not say that, but Thomas Malthus did. And he said that this was one of the things that in nature was sort of by design to help control the population. So let's look more at population, the demographic transition, the epidemiological transition in a future video, and look at a couple of curated videos that I have for you, and I'll see you again soon.